Also, if you just say who you are and where you're from.
Transparency International. I thought it was, I'll start with one of your comments, I think in the third section of your presentation, which was really interesting. You mentioned that you think that the argument that civil society produces, that their activities are not political, you think that there is less value in that. You think that at the end of the day, even if the definition is quite broad, civil society activities are political. I'm interested in that because from our perspective, I work with Transparency International Russia on a reasonably close basis, and they've gone through the investigations. They went through the first set of investigations in January and February. They passed everything through the Ministry of Justice. They looked at hundreds of documents. There were no problems. Just last month, the same person, along with prosecutor's office, came back, went through exactly the same documents, and then found a problem. Our chapter is responding to this. They have now been charged with being a foreign agent. And our chapter is going to challenge this. They note that they do not engage in politics. They engage in policy and in policy shaping. They've worked with the government on anti-corruption strategy, so they really don't think of it as being a kind of taking sides in terms of politics. That made me think that in parallel to this, in parallel to the last few years of these repressive laws that are coming in, you also note that donors themselves, donor governments or foundations themselves, have become more and more restrictive on the types of funding they produce. So it used to be the case that maybe 10 years ago there was lots of core funding produced, whereas now donors and donor governments are being a lot more restrictive themselves in the types of funding they give to civil society organizations. And that might also be a source of tension, because where before civil society organizations were more free to be able to choose how to use those funds, now they are somewhat restrained, and indeed sometimes the quality lacks because they go for the funding instead of having the money and doing what they know is right or what they feel is right, for example. Just a reflection. It'd be interesting to hear your thought on that.
Would you like to collect a few?
Up to you. How?
Yeah, let's collect another two. Anheier.
Yes. Hi, my name is Anheier. I'm a PhD student here. So first of all, thanks a lot. I found it also theoretically very interesting to think about this foreign government money in domestic politics in the context of civil society funding. And I would like to ask you if you basically said that it's a sovereignty problem. So the discourse of the national government is basically that there's a bias in the forming of public opinion. And if so, then there's the assumption that public opinion should be formed with equal chances for everybody. So, which is a strange assumption even in the national context if you look at who is going to vote, for example, right? So this assumption of this equal chances to form public opinion is a bit strange. So my question would be, do you think as scholars, when we analyze now civil society actors, should we focus more on the ends, what they want to achieve, and less on the means? Or would you say this is actually the problem and we should track exactly how, for example, funding happens, if it's transparent or not, and so on? Thanks.
I saw Felicity, and then we turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Felicity Jones from the London School of Economics. My comment actually kind of picks up the other two questions already. I was just reading the Berlin Center for Civil Society, who determinedly say that they don't use the phrase NGO because they're not going to be defined by what they're not. They define themselves by global civil society organizations. And I got an undercurrent in your talk that there's a kind of new modality of understanding different partnerships. So if a partnership is focused on a shared purpose or a shared goal or a shared outcome, then that's defining a civil society space. And picking up, sorry, I didn't catch your name, from Transparency International, whether that creates a different understanding as a funder of the sorts of organizations that you might choose to prioritize, if the goal is to support particular advocacy or activity rather than a particular kind of organization.
Thank you, Felicity. Chris?
So these are terrific thoughts, and I really appreciate the comments and insights as well as the questions. Probably the insights are more important than the questions, but let me take a crack at it. Let me start at the end. I mean, I think I don't really worry too much about the labels. I agree with you that there is this talk going on. There is worry that I've heard people complain that NGOs are killing civil society, NGOs are destroying social movements. I think that suggests a nature of what we mean by an NGO. I mentioned some poll results, some survey results in the talk, but there are a few places, Ethiopia, a couple of others, where NGOs are held in great poor regard because they're seen as vehicles, as organizations with big vehicles and big per diems and sort of like a lot of big for-profit foreign companies. So the image that the phrase NGO summons up, it seems to be very different depending on where you are and who you're talking to. And I can see why in some of those contexts you'd want a different word. But I do think when I was, Helmut and I met, as he mentioned, when I was running the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations at Harvard. And when I first took up that directorship, the faculty was meeting, debating furiously whether they should change the name of the center to the Center on Civil Society instead of Nonprofit Organizations. And the faculty, just before I joined them, had met to discuss this and decided, absolutely, we're going to change the name. They went to the donors and they said, we would like to change the name of the center to the Center on Civil Society. And the donors listened patiently, listened to their arguments, understood, and said, it's very persuasive. It sounds like you're exactly right. No, you may not change the name. And they said, well, why not if we're right? And they said, well, none of our friends would have any idea what you're talking about if we said we were supporting a Center on Civil Society. But they all know what a nonprofit is. They're on the boards. They support them. So that's what we're going to call it. So I think to some extent the naming conventions need to be shaped for individual audiences. But I do think it goes back to the question about politics and what we're talking about here. I don't think of course, former litigator, a lawyer, it's important if the rules say you can't participate in political activity, but you can do policy, then it's important to have an argument about why what you're doing is policy and not politics. There are languages, many of the major languages of the world, that don't distinguish the word for policy and the word for politics, and they're onto something. I think we may have just been too clever by half, in English at least, to separate these ideas. But when you look at what we're actually, I mean, at least when we're all sitting around in an academic environment, I think we ought to at least be able to acknowledge that when we fund independent media and journalism and investigative journalism, we understand that the journalists we're supporting are going to be revealing scandals, for the most part, in elite sections of government and corporate life. They may reveal a few NGO scandals too, but the funding of independent media, of critical debate, of genuine debate on matters of public importance, funding educational programs to combat xenophobia. These are not divorced from political considerations or from an engagement in the politics or democratic process of a society. And indeed, it's a part of why we fund them. It's different than supporting a particular party. I certainly don't want the support that we provide at the Open Society Foundations anywhere in the world to be identified as support for a particular party or candidate, as opposed for principles or policies or particular concerns. But we're not trying to pretend they're not devoted to those concerns. We would not sponsor a debate on pro or against xenophobia and indifferent to the outcome of that debate. So I think that I think in any individual circumstance, one wants to argue one is staying within whatever the legal regulations are. In the United States, most of the organizations we support are not allowed to use our funds, or at least we're not allowed to earmark funds for what they call defined lobbying. But lobbying in the U.S. is very specifically meeting and talking to legislators about particular pieces of legislation. A lot of what goes by under the term education would look like lobbying in a lot of the world. So these distinctions, I think, are not where I would put. I wouldn't put serious attention in general principle on these distinctions, though you have to use them in practice. I think that the work you're doing in Russia and globally is terrific, and I think that the problems that you're describing and with the Russian law are absolutely real. But I think that I don't, I guess, take as pessimistic a view as you do about the financial flows supporting it. It is true that many long-time donors are becoming more restrictive for all sorts of reasons of their own prudence in the way they're giving grants. There's a lot of new philanthropy that is actually more willing to take risk and actually comes up more often in the form of general support that's showing up in the world. And I think there are some forms of some of the new philanthropy, some of the really large global funders are more willing to fund politically controversial causes than some of the more traditional donors to TI and others. So I think if you just focus on, well, we used to get our money from these sources, now it comes with more restrictions, that's absolutely the right story. But I think there's a wider set of things happening in international flows to civil society that makes the picture more complicated. Maybe we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. Let's have another set of questions. Aram?
Thanks a lot for a great presentation. I'm Aram Kakagordian from the Research Center for Anti-Corruption State Building at the Hertie School. I have two questions. One is related to your definition of corruption. As being a lawyer, I would be interested to know how would you define it, because in the sense of philanthropy, I'm not sure the definition of using public resources for private gain will work here, because how would define public resources? So I'm not sure we should have another definition for this reason. And the second has to do with Russian law and implication of it, because I think what is important that we really leave out the part that this law has really strong legal implications. They can shut down every NGO that is considered foreign agent in one day. That is the whole idea of this law. It's not about labeling. It's not about calling someone foreign agent or not. It's about just shutting down in one day. And I was following, for example, Elena Pamphilova from Transparency International. She was telling in autumn there will be no independent NGO left in Russia, because what they are doing last couple of months, it's just appalling and really difficult. So I would like to know your opinion on this, because it's not just about labeling. It's much wider than that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. You're right, back there.
Thank you. My name is Aygul. I'm a sociology student at Free University of Berlin. So my question is a bit theoretical, maybe. From your presentation and also from some other readings, like not-for-profit sector was considered to be very result-oriented, helping and altruistic, but some skepticism is growing recently because this sector is getting very competitive, and kind of grant eaters are also fighting for a limited amount of grants, and maybe not-for-profit sector is also employing kind of marketing researchers to attract more public and private donations. So in this sense, do you think that work organization for NGO sector would somehow change in the nearest future? And my second question is also not related to that. I've been aware that Open Society Foundation is reducing the grants for educational programs for Central Asian region, for example. And what are the reasons, what are the explanations for grant allocation and for to some sectors and to reducing to other sectors? So thank you.
Thank you. Let's one more, the gentleman back there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Wolfgang Meyer. I used to work for Konrad Adenauer Foundation, an NGO, spreading democracy around the world.
Excellent.
Now I work as an advisor to the CDU group in faction in the German parliament. I would like to ask a little bit a question which might be a little bit provocative. Would you not find that some governments might also have some legitimate reason to curtail the work of foreign NGO organizations, like, for example, Konrad Adenauer Foundation? You know, I've been doing this work since the 70s, and I've always been surprised that we are so very welcome everywhere. But in fact, what we do, we bring our own values, our own ideas of our image of man and our ideas about the organization of society. So we would never doubt that what we think is right, like that equality is better than a nicely hierarchical order or things like that. So wouldn't there be some legitimate argument also for governments to protect themselves from the intrusion of foreign values?
Right.
Well, thank you. Over to you, Chris.
No, I think that's right. Let me come back to that at the end, because I agree with you, and I think that's the same thought that sort of prompted the talk and the series of reflections. I think the definition of corruption, at least when I was, what I meant by it was the distortion of good governance or democratic practice through the deployment of wealth or the misuse of or the playing to individual the personal interests of officials or other sorts of things like that. But I'm not limiting, I'm not at all limiting corruption, obviously, to the use of public funds. Oh, it's interesting to read the text of the Egyptian, the proposed law. It's very likely to simply be adopted, and it's very close to its current form. One of the devices it uses is it declares as a matter of law all foreign funding to NGOs, to civil society organizations in Egypt, to be public funds. They simply announce these are all public funds, and that has the effect of pulling them under a regime for the inspection and the auditing of public accounts that's much stricter than the rules, and the penalties for misuse much higher than they would be for private funds. So even this definition of public funds and private funds is in play in some of these places. But yes, I was using corruption in the sense maybe all metaphors these days are technology metaphors, but in the same way that one thinks of a corrupted hard disk, I was thinking of a corrupted democratic practice in much the same way. Something has gone wrong in what we imagine to be the sort of proper working of it. But I did it that way precisely to call into question what we mean by the proper working of democracy, because I think that's the space I'm playing with here, because I think if you have a particular vision of the proper working of democracy, then it's not hard to understand why governments would regard almost all of this activity as corrupting. I think we have to be more precise and more generous about what we mean by the proper functioning of proper, of legitimate political conversation, activity, engagement. And I think if we have a broader definition of that, then it changes some, not all, of both foreign funding and civil society activity, changes the nature of it from corrupt to actually core practice. At least that's the thesis I'm playing with in the talk, and but I take the challenge to it absolutely. I think the same response I made about the question about a general support and changing nature of funding. I don't think that there's a fundamentally different competitive landscape for civil society funding today. I think there are a lot more civil society organizations. There's a lot more money. There's a lot more sources of support. it's very hard. How do you calibrate whether there's more or less competition? I think that's actually very hard to do. There are certainly specific places, specific groups of organizations that experience big changes. There are moments in lots of regions. I remember doing work in South Africa in the 1990s. There was a period from about 1991 to about 1995 when if you had an NGO in South Africa that was working on democracy, you almost didn't have to write proposals at all. You just sort of held out your shingle and in came the funding. And then once there was a democratically elected government, and a lot of the support started moving to government projects of the Mandela administration, there became a huge sense of much greater competition, much less available funding. I'm not sure that was a global trend. I think that was the nature of political change in that country and the way that donors responded to it. And I think in moments like that, it's important to find ways, if you're in a position to provide funding, to be a counterweight to those kinds of trends. I think that's probably a partial answer to your question about Central Asia and the Open Society Foundations. The Open Society Foundations were born 20 years ago or so in three organizing struggles, essentially: the end of the Cold War, the Balkan War, and the anti-apartheid movement. George Soros's first philanthropy was for scholarships in South Africa for black African students to be able to attend traditionally white universities, and for journalists, black journalists, to work on mainstream newspapers. But the first foundation was in Hungary, and there was a time when the organization went through its last growth period or its first growth period in the early 90s, when most of the activity was in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and a little bit in South Africa. The Open Society Foundations today are about as global a foundation as exists anywhere in the world. We make grants in over 100 countries. We have offices in over 50 countries, and we are overall maintaining a steady size. So we are not reducing our funding in any area, including in education, but it does move like the tides from place to place, depending on context and circumstance. And so the funding was concentrated in Central Asia and Eastern Europe in the education area for the last 10, 12 years. Today, we are increasing our support for education in Myanmar and other parts of Southeast Asia. We're increasing our support for higher education in many parts of Africa, and we are just beginning to expand our support for some educational projects in some parts of the Caribbean and some countries in Latin America. And so you're right, the support for education in Central Asia is being reduced right now, but that's essentially a set of priorities being established by the board and by the staff in response to demand and opportunity in a global perspective, and it will continue to shift from place to place over time. In general, the Open Society Foundations fund long-term. That is, these are not year-to-year flow changes. Most of the commitments we make to countries last in the decades, not in the months or years, but they do still change over that period. And let me end with that. I'm puzzled too, right? I mean, I think, so yes, why do governments? Should one expect governments to stop the international assistance of this kind? You should absolutely expect it. Is it legitimate? That's a much more interesting question. My instinct, but I don't have a lot of confidence in the correctness of this instinct. My instinct is that is that it is legitimate for a government to restrict fairly severely, when it wants to, the ability of other governments to fund a political activity within its country. I don't know. I'd be hard pressed to come up with the argument for why the United States Congress should be able to fund political activity in other countries. And I know the United States Congress wouldn't hesitate very long to restrict funding provided by other governments on political activity in the United States. And while I could imagine a different world where I might have an argument against that, in this world, I'm not sure I could mount that case. I think that organization, that private support is different. I think, but it's a hard question to be sure. Well, why is it different? Why do we think that? The case of India is an interesting example. The Indian law prohibits the receipt of foreign funding for anything they deem political activity by NGOs and by nonprofit organizations, civil society in India. But how do they define foreign funding? If I'm a non-resident Indian working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, and I send money to my local university in my village in India, where the rest of my family lives, it's not considered foreign funding. Well, that's interesting, right? That's a non-resident Indian living in California, sending money to an NGO in India, but it's not foreign funding. If her neighbor sends money, who's not a non-resident Indian, to the same NGO, that is foreign funding, even if both sources of funding were paid by salary from the same software company in California. Can one explain that in a sense? Well, is the citizenship or dual citizenship of the donor the dispositive thing? If USAID persuaded a set of non-resident Indians to create an organization to support democracy in India, and simply gave them a big grant, instead of it coming from the software company, it came from the US government, and then they sent the money to India, would that not be foreign funding? It seems to me these categories melt in our hands here. We don't have a framework to really understand any of the categories in this debate. And it seems to me that the interesting questions are about what's legitimate, not what you would expect a state to try and repress. But I think we don't. I think we don't have the analytic categories we need on what we mean by democratic practice, about what we mean by corruption, or even what we mean by foreign funding, to take this forward more seriously. And I think this is an effort to try and see if we can build some of those categories and analytic frameworks together.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to leave it here because I think it's 1:45. I can't really see it. But yes, it is 1:45, and we said that we would finish by 1:45. Thank you very much. I know you have a very, very busy day, and you kind of put us in between many other appointments. Thank you, dear audience, for very good questions. And I must say that the topic is very dear to my heart and my interest. And I was really tempted to jump in at various points, and I'm glad I didn't, because it allowed me to listen, and it was certainly worth listening to what you had to say, what you had to ask, and of course your 3 stories made it all worthwhile. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.